Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Castleberry, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2024 Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual festival day for a conversation with Chun, Kevin Barry, and Andrew Krivak. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by all the authors in the program can be purchased in the link below. I'm going to take just a couple minutes to introduce all our authors. Chun is a bilingual Chinese-American writer and literary translator. Her debut story collection, How, was longlisted for the 2022 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. She's also the author of 2 books of poetry, Travel Over Water and Lantern Puzzle, a novel in Chinese, Peach Tree in the Sea, and 4 volumes of translations. A recipient of an NEA Literature Fellowship, a Sustainable Arts Foundation Award, and 3 Pushcart Prizes, she teaches at Providence College and lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome, Chun. Kevin Barry is the author of the novels Night Boat to Tangier, Beetlebone, City of Bohan, and The Heart in Winter, as well as 3 story collections, including That Old Country Music. His stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, and elsewhere. He also works as a playwright and screenwriter and lives in County Sligo, Ireland. Hello, Kevin.
Nice to see you all. Hi.
And finally, Andrew Krivak is the author of the award-winning freestanding novels of the Dardan trilogy, The Sojourn, The Signal Flame, and Like the Appearance of Horses, as well as The Bear, a National Endowment for the Arts Big Read selection. He's a volunteer discussion facilitator in the New Hampshire Department of Corrections Family Connection Center and a visiting lecturer at Harvard. Krivak lives with his wife and 3 children in Somerville, Massachusetts, and Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
So our theme for our discussion is violent new lands. It's a theme that definitely connects all these stories, these really pretty epic novels. All of them feature immigrant characters, first generation characters often, facing a violent new land, whether that is America itself in kind of foundational years, or if that means traveling abroad in times of war. I want to kind of get started by just talking about, big picture stuff about these books. I guess I'll start just because this is the way I have my notes set up. I'll start with Kevin. Kevin, your novel, The Heart in Winter, is set in 19th century Montana, and it centers on a dope addict named Tom Rourke and the newlywed Polly Gillespie. It's sort of this comical star-crossed lovers adventure story. I found it to be just, hilarious and heartbreaking, and just a really cool read. Can you tell us a little bit about, how you got started in this story world? What drew you to Montana?
Yeah, it's a long and quite bitter story because it took me a really long time to get this book together. It's my 7th book, as you mentioned. My other one's there, but it was the first one I attempted. I tried to write it first in the summer of 1999, when I was obviously an extremely young man at that point. I was working at that time in Cork City in Ireland as a freelance journalist, but I had the notion that the time had come. I was 29 years old, and I said, "It's time, young man, to write your novel." So I moved down I saved up enough money to give it a summer, to give it 3 months. And I went down to the coast of County Cork, and I got there like I didn't even have a laptop at the time. I had my notebooks, and I had this little trailer I bought on a beach, and I sat in it with the idea of writing a novel, and I had no idea what I was going to write a novel about. So I started to go on long, very kind of anxious walks in the local mountains in County Cork. And one day I literally almost fell into a hole in the ground in these abandoned copper mines in West Cork in Ireland. And I started to read up a little bit about them and found out that they'd played out in the 1880s, and all of the miners had moved pretty much en masse to Butte, Montana, because they were mining copper in Butte. America was being electrified. And I went, wow, 1890s Irish miners in Montana. I have got a Western, but it's got Irish accents, so I can do this one. I know what these people sound like. I've been listening to them for long enough. So I thought to myself, all I've got to do really is get to Butte. I've got to go to Butte, Montana, and it was my first trip there to the US in October of '99. I flew to
Wow.
Seattle and got on a Greyhound bus for like 16 hours and arrived in Butte. And it's very proud of its Irish heritage, which is it's got a vast Irish heritage, and it's very proud of it in Butte. And when you show up with an actual Irish accent, you're quickly embraced into the bosom of the town. Um, I was like, you get more reserved, I think, as you get older, but I wasn't reserved at all when I was 29, and I was literally stopping people in the street and in bars and in restaurants in Butte going, I'm writing a novel about this place. What have you got for me? And they were incredibly kind. People were really lovely. And I got this amazing material. I was getting letters that heartbroken miners had sent back to Ireland in the 1890s, and all this great texture for a novel. And I went back to Ireland and I wrote 120,000 words. I really dogged it out. And even as I was writing it, I knew it wasn't coming alive on the page. I had the atmosphere of a novel. I had this great place and this great setup, but I didn't have the characters yet. And it was another 23 years before they appeared. I wrote six other books, and one day late in the pandemic, I was just walking in the woods in County Sligo, where I live now, and I thought, what if it's just a really kind of condensed story? What if it's just a love story? And I saw this young man and young woman riding double on a horse, and I thought, that's them. That's the novel. They're called Tom and Polly, and they're runaway lovers, and that's all I need to do. So I then wrote the novel very quickly. The star-crossed lovers, as you say, kind of story. So the book kind of took a quarter of a century, and it took 10 months at the same time. But it's very unpredictable, when the book is ready to go. And often people ask, what's the trick of it with writing fiction? And the trick of it is figuring out what's the right book for this time in your life. What's the story that you're ready to write now? Often early on in a writing career, ambition and ability aren't matching up. You're trying to write novels that you might be years and decades away from. That was certainly the case with me. I didn't know at this point in 1999 how to reduce all the great research material I had. I didn't know how to bring it down and let it recede into the background. And it took a long time before that was there.
Wow. So this was kind of at the back of your mind for a really long
I
time.
guess so. Like I have the original draft somewhere in a box under a bed, and I haven't even looked at it. I couldn't bear to go in there. I know it's in the house, and I kind of like having it in the house. Um, but it's kind of, yeah. One thing I think, as any writer's writing practice develops, one thing you learn is that there are always abandoned projects and there are always abandoned stories, but they're never fully abandoned. They always sit somewhere back in your unconscious, and they're just waiting for some spark that will help to bring them to life again. That nothing is ever really thrown away. Yeah, it's always sitting there somewhere, and you always think maybe. And maybe once or twice in the intervening years, I remember when they started screening the great Deadwood TV series, I thought, wow, that's a really good way to write a really profane late 1800s Western. I could have done it that way. But I didn't really think about it very often until just a moment appeared and when I saw the characters. And often you're waiting for the characters and the stage to be right for each other. When there's a moment when you can hear it, when it's like a tuning fork, and when the ringing is through, and it's time to go then to do it then. But it's unpredictable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I bet a lot of us, I bet a lot of writers have some story that they've had to return to after years. And I definitely know that feeling of, in a way, just kind of carrying these stories with you, right, for years and then decades, and they're still in there. Um, yeah, I want to quickly just move on to Chun and have kind of a similar question about, kind of how this story got started for you. Um, uh, your novel, Straw Dogs of the Universe, tells a kind of intertwined story. The orphaned Sixiang, as we begin the story, is in China, and she's going to come to America to try to find her father, Gui Feng, who has been working for a little while. And both of them kind of have their own story arcs in a way as they slowly come to meet one another. Um, can you tell us a little bit about, yeah, how did this one get started? What inspired you? Why this period and place, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I taught an interdisciplinary course with a history professor on East and West encounter, and one of the units focused on early Asian immigration to America. I was struck by how much I had not known about this history. I didn't know that it was mostly Chinese workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad across the Sierra, and an estimated 1,200 of them died during the construction. I also didn't know the first US immigration law was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, targeting explicitly Chinese and Chinese Americans. So I thought one reason of my ignorance had to do with the erasure of this history. It just had been largely excluded from public discourse. So I wanted to learn more about the history. And as a writer, the best way to learn about something is to write about it. And there was also a personal connection. So I was visiting my parents in China this summer while doing this research. And my father told me um, my great grandfather had actually come to America and built the Transcontinental Railroad. And I had
Mhm.
always known that this ancestor had worked overseas, and was able to save enough money to build this two-story house my father grew up in. But somehow I didn't know the fact that he actually had gone to America, stayed for 20 years, then maybe couldn't start a family, then came back to China and built a house, had a family. So the house, this two-story house, was something my father liked to talk about. That seemed to be the glorious part of this family lore, not the hardship, the breakback labor, the kind of discrimination he must have endured. So this people, these early immigrants, are my precursors. They came to America during the first wave of Chinese immigration. And I came here 150 years later. So I wanted to know, how our experiences are similar or dissimilar. A lot have changed since then, but then some stayed perhaps the same, such as our ambivalence towards home and belonging. And during the pandemic, amid this rise of anti-API violence, some of the differences seem to also have collapsed. So all those factors figure into the writing. I from the very beginning, I knew I was going to have main character who's a railroad worker, but this um, Sixiang, this plot line came later when I was doing free writing, and somehow this little girl emerged, and possibly because my daughter was 10 when I was started the novel. So it was, so then my protagonist, this also was is 10-year-old. So then with the emergence of this character, then this plot line of daughter looking for her father sort of also came.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting already, like these novels that seem so far afield in a way, so way back in history, um, and so full of adventure. Already, there's this real personal connection to the stories. I'm learning from y'all, that these kind of grow out of that personal connection. That's really interesting. I remember as an undergrad seeing the photo of the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's a really famous photograph, and it's all white workers,
Yeah,
that are
no
within the frame
Chinese
of the photo.
face. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the revelations of reading your book, is seeing the incredible contributions of Chinese immigrants during this time, this really formative time.
Yeah.
Um, it's really kind of amazing research work that you did in that, that I think I want to return to you. Um, well, Andrew, your novel, like The Appearance of Horses, is another epic. This one especially. I mean, it covers so much time. You bounce around intergenerationally, starting from that period between the world wars up until the early 2000s, and follow, this family through all this time. Um, I guess your question should be a little bit different because this is part of this, series of standalone novels that are all set in the fictional town of Dardan, Pennsylvania. But what got you started on this particular one, and kind of like why the structure?
Yeah, well, it won't be a surprise, perhaps, to find out that my story and Kevin's and Ye's are exactly the same in many ways. I grew up with my grandparents were Slovak immigrants. After the First World War, my grandfather fought for the Austro-Hungarian army in a Slovak March battalion on the Piava River, was captured, sent to Sardinia for 6 months as a prisoner of war, and then walked home to this new country of Czechoslovakia. And then in the Wilson Masaryk détente, he came to America. So my mother, English was her second language. She spoke this dialect of Slovak, Shadish. And my grandfather died from black lung from the mines before I was born. But I grew up listening to my grandmother just tell stories about the war, about growing up in a village in eastern Slovakia. And so there was, those seeds were just being planted in my head. It was just my younger brother and I in my grandmother's house, coal stove, my mother translating what she could, but just listening to this tapestry of Eastern European folklore, as it were, but all of it true, it turns out. So when I turned to fiction, and I was, later in my life, well into my 30s, I wanted to tell the story about this grand expanse. And Kevin, I know what you mean by just the chopping down. It turns out that my first novel was just a very spare, 180 pages, if that, novel about a young man who goes off to World War I. He's conscripted, and it wasn't entirely about my grandfather, but his ghost loomed large, and it was more of an amalgam of all the characters I'd heard during my life. All the stuff that was laying down, I wanted to create this epic from the start, but the stuff I chipped away at, I then moved to the second novel and thought maybe there's really a story here about the generation that listens to these stories. And so then it moves to 1972. And in fact, the Sojourn is told from a night in March of 1972 about Joseph Vinich's coming of age in the war. So I created this other story about a young man who's missing in action in Vietnam in 1972. Because when I grew up, my older brothers were of the Vietnam era, and the question was, my grandfathers fought in World War I, my father fought in World War II, my brothers were about to go fight in Vietnam, and I thought, oh, is this what you do as an American boy? You fight your war, and then you get on with your life, right? And so I wrote that story as a sort of the second one as a kind of eye on that single year. And then so during COVID, I wanted to pull it all together. And it just seemed now that I was capable of writing the longer intergenerational sweep of it from the end of World War I up to 2003. So it's 1933 to 2003 in that stretch. When I put it together chronologically, all of the generations, it just didn't work for me. I mean, it moved, right? But there was something else about the way in which I wanted to tell these stories. And I thought back to my grandmother again. When she would tell a story, it was never, you would get the arc in the middle of the time that you sat in front of the stove with her. But then on Christmas Eve at the Velia feast, she'd say, do you remember that Uncle Joe that I was telling you about? Well, his story is connected to this story. And you would jump back to another part of the old country. And then, Easter, you're sitting around and she would say, oh, Andro, do you remember I told you about Aunt Sue? Well, let me tell you about what she did. And then all of a sudden these timelines come together, and you have these again, a sort of tapestry of stories. So I realized once I started to put them together in a different order, an entirely different story came to be. And that title comes from the prophet Joel, where he's telling the Israelites about a plague of locusts. And he says, their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses, so they run. And I went back to this idea of intergenerational war. And yet the stories all follow in an arc. I mean, apropos of our panel, what do you need for war? You need bodies, desire, and the lack of a desire. And on those three dynamics take place on a field. And so what I wanted to do was to put those all into conflict with each other, see what happens. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really love that part you mentioned about the way your grandmother tells stories, like actually helping you to understand how to tell your story.
Right.
That it can be fragmented.
It was often in Slovak. My mother would translate, and there are times when I just will throw pieces of Slovak or Ruthenian into these novels, and not translate them, because I was trying to think, well, what would it be like if you were living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and someone spoke a language that you didn't know? You would just have to get on with it. You get the context and move on. So,
yeah. And another kind of commonality I'm seeing between everybody. I mean, other than COVID, I think everybody's mentioned that at some point in their writing process, the lockdown like aided or helped them focus or something. But also this idea of as writers having to get to where you're capable of writing the story that you're wanting to write, um, or getting to some stage in life when you're really ready to tackle that story. Is that something that I guess we've all kind of run into in different ways? It seems like it.
Yeah. I mean, I think often early on in a fiction writing career or a fiction writing practice, the motion is kind of circular. You're circling around your fundamental stories for a long time while you develop a thick enough skin actually to really go in and tackle them. And you can kind of know very very early what your fundamental stories are that you want to tell, but still not have a way of approach for it yet, and it could take a long time to get there. In the case of this book for me, I think when I did the first tranche of work on it in the late 1990s, I kind of got so caught up in the atmosphere of the town, and I kind of got so engaged by my research that I forgot about writing a novel in a fundamental way of really inhabiting the characters. And it takes a lot of kind of waiting before the story will come into focus for you. Then it was kind of, this book for me was I guess my first piece of historical fiction. My novel Beetlebone is set in the 1970s, and that almost is a historical fiction now, I guess, as well. Even though I'm old enough to have a sense memory of the 1970s, so I was there. But with this one, it was the first time I was writing historical fiction, and again, the fundamental thing for me was trying to make the research disappear on the page. I don't, as a reader, I don't hover towards historical fiction that much. But I read the best of it. And if you read the very best writers of historical fiction, I have to mention someone like Hilary Mantel and her Wolf Hall novels. When you read those, you can't see the research on the page. It's there, but it's submerged, and it's somehow given the story its weight and its depth, but it's somehow kept to the sides. And it took a long while for me to have anything like the chops necessary to do that with this story.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and another great way to kind of capture all three of these. Because as I was reading these books, I didn't put them into the same words, but it does feel like the research is submerged. Like these are just like compelling narratives, and there's clearly a whole lot of work going on behind the scenes to make it real. Chun, have you had kind of similar experience as far as what Andrew and Kevin have both talked about, kind of like having to kind of get to the point where you're ready to tackle a project or ready to tackle even this particular book?
Yeah, I never thought about it in that kind of term, but thinking about it now, it seems necessary for me to have lived in this country for 20 years to write about a historical novel on the early Chinese immigrants. Maybe I've just known my own life in enough, full enough, deep enough to make this that kind of comparison, or to be fully invested in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that surprised me, Brian, about all three of us is the way in which the West has, I don't know, been a catalyst, if you will, or somehow precipitated parts of the novel and the actual historical connections of family to the West. The entire idea of writing a novel for me started when I found out that there was a large population of Slovak immigrants in Pueblo, Colorado, working in the smelters from the ore that would come down from places like Leadville and then go east. And my great grandfather worked there, and his wife was killed by a train. But before she was killed by the train, she threw her young baby boy over the trestle into the water, and a young boy swimming saved him. It was my great uncle Joe, and then so my great grandfather Andrew had to go back to Austria-Hungary with three daughters and a baby boy, and that's why my grandmother, who was born in America, was raised in the shadow of World War I because her father had nowhere else to go to work and get a job and raise his kids. And so, yeah, I think that's each of you, Montana and the linking up with the Trans-Pacific Railroad. That's, the West is there. It's pretty cool. So.
Yeah, I think when you start to look into histories of migration to the American West, what's very interesting coming from a country like Ireland is it would often be people from the same village or town would go to the same place because of the local connection, and often because they might have been engaged in the same profession. In this case, copper miners. And since I published the book, I've had so many Butte, Montana stories coming into me on emails and in notes coming in. The writer Roddy Doyle was ongoing. My great grandmother's stepsister ran a saloon in Butte in 1914. And there's just thousands of these stories out there. But it's what was really useful for me and what made this story feel fresh for me is like the history of the Irish in America is vast and is very well chronicled, but we tend to hear about it more so in terms of the Irish in New York or the Irish in Boston or the Irish in Chicago in the big cities. So to see how the new Irish community organized itself in a smaller, much more contained world like Butte was really interesting, actually. Like Irish people have always been economic migrants. We've always been economic refugees for centuries. We almost invented it as a thing, just going around the world to wherever would take us and finding jobs there. And the communities, the way they organized themselves, always the Irish people started when they set up in a new place by opening small little businesses, often pubs, for whatever reason. And from there, they would very quickly take over the police apparatus of the city, and from there they would move into the political apparatus of the city. And this is very evident in Butte. And if you went back to Butte 10 years after this novel is set, it's become a little Irish machine town. Like a miniature, a Chicago or a Boston in miniature. So it was a really fascinating canvas and a reduced canvas to see the way this kind of this community played itself out. Like the Irish have always been very good at migrancy. We've been good migrants. We're quite personable people. We talk and smile a lot, and we can be quite charming. But there's also a canniness. There's a native canniness about how to get on, in these newly forming worlds and societies.
Yeah, that seems to be a quintessential part of the immigrant experience too, right? That it's like finding a way to get by and get through and find a way to fit in. That's running through all these stories as well. Yeah, wow. I want to talk about some openings as a way to, I guess, readers who, again, don't forget, you can buy the books at the bottom of the page here, so that readers have a sense of kind of how these stories get off the ground. Maybe I'll start with Andrew. Your novel, it begins with this really amazing, beautiful scene where Hannah Vinich is at home, kind of looking out the window and sees this boy approaching the house. So this kind of mysterious figure who we're going to learn, or we're going to learn to call Bex pretty soon. These are kind of the foundational characters for, the sweep of this, vast novel. Can you tell us a little bit about, yeah, that initial scene and kind of how they interact, how they get to know one another? Um,
Yeah. So again, I have to go back to the Sojourn. They all are freestanding, but Bex is a baby that the character Joseph Vinich rescues in World War I from a Roma woman who's pregnant with him, and takes him back to the Compania of Rome on the Shio River in what at the time was Austria-Hungary or Hungary at the time, and Eastern Slovakia. And so I knew that he would come back to America because Hannah has these two boys who are of half Roma, half American, or I should say half Slovak blood, right? And they both mirror the father Bex. Bejet is the Roma name, but so I had to bring him back, and I was thinking about how do I get him in there? And I wanted like the appearance of horses to be framed by Hannah. She is the young girl at the beginning. She's the old woman knocking on the door of death at the end. And so I just imagined honestly, I'll tell you, she was a bit of my mother, my grandfather who was in the war. He's a great builder and built the house that she grew up in. It was when I was a kid, it just seemed like a mansion next to our house that we built. Apple trees, land. My grandfather just bought up a ton of land during the Depression with the money he made in the coal mines. And so I envisioned that house and Hannah as a girl looking through that front window and watching this character come up the street. And the character sees the house too. So the two of them are in this dialogue, this place holding dialogue, seeing each other. And Hannah's heard these stories from her father, and now it all starts to make sense. This is he. This is the boy. This is the baby. This is the one person he's saved in a time and in a land where nobody was saved, or very few. And so, and then Kevin, he knows how to get by. He learns English thanks to Hannah's father, and Joseph's family, the Vinich family, is as accepting of him as he is wanting to be a part of it. And then Joseph Vinich means the vine in Slovak, and Bajet's grandfather gives him a fake passport and says, "You're a Connor now. You're the branch. Go find the vine." And so he gets to America, and so that's how the two come together, and then they grow up together, and fall in love, and novel ensues. So
yeah. I mean, it's a really amazing opening, and I mean maybe that's a way to segue to Chun's too, because a very young person traveling to America on a mission is kind of how your novel begins as well. It actually, it starts with that incredible the flood scene, and all this incredible stuff that kind of kicks off the book. In the second chapter, though, we come to America and meet up with the father, the kind of estranged father who's been, trying to send money back to the family and everything, Guifeng. And you have that incredible first chapter of him at work. Can you tell us a little bit about that and like what went into it? What's going on with him?
Okay. Yeah. So, from very early on in the process, I knew a main character would be a railroad worker, both because of this family connection and also because building the railroad was one of the few available professions for Chinese immigrants. But there are really not a lot of historical documents, records about their experience. But some Asian American historians, especially Gordon Chan, who wrote this book called The Ghost of Gold Mountains, a recent book which did extraordinary scholarship. So I drew quite a bit historical detail from that book. But a main event in this chapter is about the strike, which 3,000 Chinese workers across the summit area of the Sierra Mountain, spanning 30 miles, went on strike together. And that was actually the largest labor strike in America during that era.
Wow.
But again, it's a historical fact that's mostly written out of history, and nobody knows how they were able to organize. So that was very challenging and also fun for me to speculate, imagine how that happened. During my research, I also, watched some popular shows about the railroad building, Hell on Wheels, Hell on Wheels. I don't know if you all watched that, but it's a TV show with five seasons about the building of Transcontinental Railroad, and the last season was set in on the Sierra Mountain. I wasn't thrilled about the depiction of that. What happens is this, protagonist basically took the credit, most of the credit, and the few Chinese characters were basically relegated to minor roles, serving either as his love interest or foil. So my writing was, in part a response to this kind of all too familiar white-centric trope. So in my book, I put the Chinese characters to the forefront of the narrative. It's a book about their struggle, their failure, feeling their transformation and possible heroism. Yeah, I think it is a really apt name. The violent new world for our panel. But for this early Chinese immigrants, that kind of usual violence associated with the Wild West was also compounded by this rampant anti-Chinese rhetoric. So it was even harder for these Chinese immigrants to survive or thrive in this land. I was very drawn to that intense tension. My question was, how could one try make a life in a land that doesn't want them? And I feel, unfortunately, this is a question that many immigrants still have to ask now today.
Yeah. I mean, in the news right now, Haitian immigrants are probably asking similar questions at this very moment. One of the other things that you've mentioned a few times, Chun, is this notion of erasure. That part of the project of your book is to unerase some of that history, and I feel like that's in common with all these stories too, because we've heard today, like Kevin talking about the Irish immigrants, the kind of image that we have of just like Boston and New York, but really there's these Irish immigrant communities kind of all over. I guess that's one of the things all three of these books is doing that kind of unerasing of American history and bringing forth these immigrant experiences. I have one last question for Kevin, and I hope we still have time to catch up on anything else we didn't get to. But you mentioned kind of how you had this image. You saw two people riding on a horse, and that was like, okay, that's my image, and that's what got you started on the romance story. Specifically in your book, your two main characters, Tom and Polly, meet at the photographer's studio. There's this really incredible, what Hollywood would call a meet cute moment between them, and then things just get started. Can you tell us a little bit about their romance, them?
Yeah, When I had that sort of vision of them on kind of day one of this young couple on horseback, when you have a moment like that, you also need an additional detail that really makes it stick. And I saw them both as quite slight, physically slight characters, kind of wayfish, almost like a pair of elves, you know. There was going to be an element, and when you put your characters into the woods in a story, it's going to take on elements of fairy story very quickly as well. My way in with these characters, Thomas, 29-year-old Irishman, dissolute, a doper, a drinker, wants to be a kind of a poet, wants to be a kind of an outlaw figure, has no idea who he is kind of searching for an identity in the world. Whereas Polly, who has come from back east, from mysterious and somewhat kind of troubled circumstances, but we sense immediately with Polly that she's very comfortable in her own skin, that she knows exactly who she is. And when you're writing a love story, you're immediately on very tricky ground. It's swampy ground, and you can fall into the goo and drown in the goo. Just as in life, the couple have to be right for each other. And it's the fact that he's searching for an identity and she already has one. I think that makes them work as a pair. With Tom, he's a 29-year-old also he has literary ambition. And I know what that feels like to be a 29-year-old of literary ambition. It's an exalted state to find yourself in life, and also usually a catastrophe at the same time. So that was my kind of path to Tom. I think you become more economical as your writing life goes on. Like I won't give a novel 6 months or a year now to see if it'll work. I'll give it a couple of weeks to see if I can get some of that all important flow going. So I said at the very start of this, I'm going to give Tom a week, and then I'm going to give Polly a week. And I wrote Tom for a week, and it's much as the book opens, he's on this kind of long lost night around Butte, around the bars and the dope houses, and he's stumbling around. I thought it felt promising. And week two, I started to write from Polly's point of view. And inside about 10 minutes, I said, "Oh, you have a novel." Because she was just there and she was just ready to go. And it's that moment of the characters finding the stage and the tuning fork strikes and it rings cleanly, and you know you're away and you have it.
Wow, that's awesome. So that's not only is that kind of the reader's experience of where this novel really gets off the ground, it was for you too as the writer. That's the
Yeah,
moment.
and I have to say it's like one thing that we probably all three of us say is westerns are an enormous amount of fun to write. Uh, it's you know it's a very engaging world to disappear into. And I don't often kind of find myself leaping out of bed in the morning with glee to get to my desk. But with this novel, I was very happy to go to work in it every day. It was fun. I was having a good time with it. And I try to remind myself always when I'm writing a piece of fiction, have a good time. If you're not having a good time at your end of the process, beloved reader, down the line isn't going to be having a good time either. So I try to tell myself it should be fun.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good advice. Well, we might have time for one really quick question just to kind of wrap things up. And we've kind of touched on this already, but I guess to everybody, you know, do you feel like, I mean, is there something about kind of America in its foundational stages in a way where violence is kind of part of the definition? I mean, it seems like when we write about this time period, there is just violence is going to be part of the story, or when we're writing about the 20th century, Andrew. I mean, all of those wars that Americans were sent off for. What do we make of that? Like, what do we make of that connection between these stories? That kind of violence at the heart of things.
I would say that I mean I think your question is a great one, and certainly the 20th century is one of the most violent, bloodiest. But I just think violence is always with us. I mean, think about the Scottish and the English battles and what that must have been like. Think about the Hundred Years' War. I mean, think about Napoleon and the Russians duking it out on the plains of Europe. It just the beginning of the Iliad begins with the word menin, which is just wrath. So I hear you. I think that for our time, it's good to know that our particular situation has particular ways of pain and struggle and suffering inflicted. But unfortunately, I feel it's a legacy, you know, and maybe that's what the sweep of any generation or century is gonna indicate. So yeah.
Yeah, that's I can't argue with that. We're a violent species.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm sorry,
well,
I should have gone last on that one.
Yeah, I guess in any story about human endeavor and human adventure and human conflict, violence is going to come into it. The decision you have to make then as a writer is how do you deal with it on the page. And I think the every book is going to have different solutions to how you do that. Very quickly with this novel, for me, I knew there was violence in the story from the start, but I found that the camera was averting its gaze whenever the violence appeared. So it was kind of more reported on than shown in the moment, and that felt like the right tactic in this. I didn't want to get away from the essential fact that this is a love story. This is about the heart, and this is about romance and lust, and all these wonderful things. So, like I think it was like I always misattribute quotes. I could never figure out where they're from, but I think it was Iris Murdoch who said that when every novel you write, every time it's like jumping off a cliff again and having to reinvent the rope as you go down. There are always new problems and new solutions you have to find. And I think in tackling one of the essential human subjects like violence, it's always you're looking for a new way to try and cover it.
mhm.
Yeah, I really resonate with what Kevin and Andrew just said. It seems like it just is there. Violence is there. But when you write about violence as a writer, how do you respond to that? How do you let your characters respond to that? That's kind of the main question for a writer. My novel is, I have to be I have to honor that kind of, the reality of the history. I could not erase that violence from the novel. I have to really respond to those. But then main question is how those characters are able to try to build a life, in between this violence, those violent events, how to form ties and how to even build a family and even make a home. So so amid this kind of violence, there's this still resilience. There is still this even moments of transcendence. Those are the things I was equally interested in writing this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, somehow we're already out of time. This has been really great. So great to meet all of you and talk about these incredible books. And like I said, be sure to purchase them. You can follow the link at the bottom of the page. And yeah, so thanks, Chun and Kevin and Andrew, everyone. Consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 19th year of presenting free literary programming. And a reminder, if you're in New York City this week, join us for our citywide bookends, as well as our in-person Children's Day and Festival Day that take place on September 28th and 29th in downtown Brooklyn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much. Thank you.